The intake form said non-essential personnel in the Velthari classification column, which told me everything I needed to know about how the next 6 weeks were going to go. I'd worked Velthari contracts before, 3 of them across 2 systems. They run the same way every time. You arrive, you present your certifications, a ridge-skulled administrator with slate-purple skin and the expression of a man who has been personally offended by your existence scans your credentials, enters something in a terminal, and hands you a laminated badge that identifies you as a maintenance contractor, which in Velthari bureaucratic language translates roughly to tolerated inconvenience. You go where they point you. You fix what they've broken. You don't use their commissary. You file your reports through a secondary channel that routes to a junior clerk who may or may not forward them. You collect your hours. You leave. I was fine with all of that. I've been doing this work for 11 years. I'm not looking for a commendation plaque. My name is Dara Osai. I'm 38 years old, born in the Korvath settlement on Cauldron-9's northern shelf, which is a sentence that, when I say it to most species, produces a specific quality of silence. Cauldron-9 is a Class 17 death world. Hyrad background from 3 collapsed ore processing stations that nobody ever fully decommissioned, surface toxin layer from 2 centuries of colonial extraction venting, seismic activity on a 14-day cycle that ranges from mild to, the ground is currently rearranging itself. The Velthari have been extracting from it for 60 years. They've never lived on it. They run their operations from pressurized administrative blocks and rotate their personnel out every 8 weeks because the accumulated exposure tables get uncomfortable past that point. I grew up there. I'm not going to explain the biology of it in detail because I don't fully understand it myself, and the xenobiologists who have studied Cauldron-9 humans don't agree with each other. The short version is that a Class 17 death world, if you're born into it and survive the first decade, produces something. The body adapts. Not fully, not safely by any external standard. The longevity tables for Cauldron-9 humans aren't flattering, but functionally. The rad tolerance is the part most people focus on, because it's the most measurable. The rest of it is harder to quantify. The seismic instinct, the gas sense, the particular relationship with systems under stress that I've never been able to explain to anyone who didn't grow up somewhere like Cauldron-9. You learn to read a failing structure the way other people read faces. The Velthari didn't know any of this about me, and I didn't tell them. The facility was called Vault Station Marath 7. It sat in a mid-latitude canyon system on Cauldron-9's eastern continent, dug into the canyon wall at 3 levels, administration and operations on the top level, active storage on the middle level, deep storage in the lower vaults. The Velthari had been using it for 43 years. The original construction was colonial era, which in practical terms meant the seals were old, the structural documentation was incomplete, and a significant portion of the lower vault contents had been entered in a classification system that the current administrative staff couldn't fully parse because it predated 2 format migrations. This was, in fact, why I was there. My contract was a routine structural and systems maintenance survey, the kind of work that accumulates when a facility gets old enough that nobody wants to look at it too closely. Seal integrity checks on the lower vault blast doors, ventilation system diagnostics, radiation containment monitoring calibration. 6 weeks of work that nobody currently on staff was certified to perform on colonial-era equipment. I arrived on a Wednesday. The administrator who processed my intake was named Overseer Drethval, tall even for a Velthari, ridge skull prominent, wearing the kind of flat bureaucratic expression that I've come to recognize as the face a species makes when it has decided that paperwork is a form of moral authority. He scanned my credentials, looked at my homeworld designation on the intake form, looked at me, and then looked at the intake form again in the way people do when they're trying to reconcile something that doesn't fit their existing categories. Cauldron-9, he said, Northern Shelf. Corvath Settlement, I said. Born there, I still hold a residential registration. He wrote something in his terminal. I didn't ask what. He handed me the laminated badge. Non-essential personnel, classification 9. He told me my work area was the lower vault access corridor and the middle-level mechanical room. He told me I was not to enter the administrative level without an escort. He told me the commissary was for Velthari staff. I said I understood, clipped the badge to my suit, and went to find the maintenance depot. The facility's maintenance depot was on the middle level, tucked behind the ventilation plant in a space that had clearly been an afterthought. It was the kind of room that tells you a lot about how a facility thinks of maintenance work. Small, poorly lit, equipped with a workbench that had been repaired at least 4 times, and a parts inventory that hadn't been properly updated since the previous contractor left. The previous contractor's last log entry was dated 14 months ago. It said, in the flat terminology of someone who had given up, recommend immediate structural review of lower vault east corridor. Seal degradation exceeds tolerance threshold. Filed to secondary channel 3. I found the filed report in the secondary channel. It had been received, logged, and marked under review by a junior clerk. 14 months ago. It had not been reviewed. I added it to my working file. The first week was documentation. That's always the first week on a contract like this. You can't fix what you haven't mapped. I walked the accessible sections of the lower vault, which meant the east and west access corridors and the primary ventilation trunk. The blast doors to the actual vault chambers were sealed. I could inspect the door mechanisms and the seal condition from the corridor side, which was enough to tell me what I needed to know. What I needed to know was, this facility was old. The seals on the lower vault blast doors had been degrading for at least a decade, and the middle-level ventilation system had 2 bypass valves that were stuck open when they should have been operable, which meant the negative pressure envelope that was supposed to contain any lower vault event wasn't functioning as designed. I wrote this up in a report. I filed it through the primary channel, addressed to Overseer Drethval, with the secondary channel report attached as supporting documentation. The response came back in 6 hours. It was from a junior administrator named Clerk Tertiary Orvine, not from Drethval. It said, your report has been received and logged. Maintenance personnel are reminded that operational assessments outside the scope of the contracted work order require supervisor authorization. Please confine your survey to the items specified in the work order. I read this twice. Then I wrote a second report, addressed to Drethval directly, which said, the items specified in the work order cannot be completed safely until the ventilation bypass issue is addressed, because the work order requires me to enter the lower vault access corridor, and the current ventilation configuration means that any seal breach during my work would not be contained. I am requesting authorization to address the bypass valves as a safety prerequisite. The response came back in 12 hours. It was again from Clerk Tertiary Orvine. It said, authorization for scope modification requires regional oversight approval, which has been requested. Estimated response time, 14 to 21 days. Please proceed with work order items that do not require lower vault access in the interim. So I proceeded with the work order items that did not require lower vault access. I checked the middle-level radiation containment monitors. Of the 23 units installed, 11 were functioning within spec, 7 were reading but out of calibration, and 5 were dark, no power, no signal, no indication of when they'd last been maintained. I recalibrated the 7. I ran a diagnostic on the 5 dark ones and found that 3 had been disconnected from the power grid at some point, for reasons that weren't documented. I reconnected them, 2 came back, 1 was hardware dead. I wrote up the monitor status and filed it. No response. I checked the middle-level structural seals. the ones I could access without authorization. The East Wing corridor seals were in reasonable condition. The central hub seals showed hairline stress fractures consistent with seismic fatigue, not critical, but worth addressing. I wrote up the seal status and filed it. Response time, 4 days. The response said, "Thank you for your report. The items noted are within acceptable variance." I had not been told what the acceptable variance thresholds were. I had not been shown the structural tolerance documentation that would allow me to verify this claim. I requested both. I did not receive them. This was the end of week 2. I spent week 3 on the ventilation system, the parts of it I was authorized to touch, and on reading everything I could find in the facility's document archive about the lower vault contents. The archive was a mess. Colonial-era records in an obsolete format, partially migrated, with gaps wherever the migration had encountered errors and defaulted to skipping the entry. What I could piece together was this. The lower vaults contained 43 years of accumulated colonial extraction materials. Most of it was classified as processed ore and refined industrial compounds. Some of it was classified under codes I didn't recognize, which when I cross-referenced against a colonial-era materials index I downloaded before this contract told me they were early-generation radiological processing byproducts. The kind of thing that came out of the first generation of Velthari colonial extraction, before the Empire formalized its containment protocols. This was not nothing. Early-generation radiological byproducts, depending on the specific compounds and the age of the containment vessels, could range from stable and routine to considerably less stable, depending on how they'd been stored, whether the vessels had been maintained, and whether the containment seals had held for 4 decades in a seismically active zone. I wrote a third report. I made it as plain as I knew how to make it. I said, I have identified materials in the lower vault classification records that appear to be early-generation radiological processing byproducts from the colonial extraction period. I cannot assess the condition of the containment vessels because I do not have authorization to enter the vault chambers. I am requesting that authorization, or alternatively requesting that a qualified Velthari radiological specialist be assigned to assess the vault contents. I flagged it priority safety concern and sent it to Drethval on the primary channel. Drethval responded personally this time, in 48 hours. He said, "The lower vault contents have been classified and inventoried by certified Velthari specialists. Your assessment of the classification codes is incorrect. Those codes refer to a previous version of our materials taxonomy, not to the compounds you have inferred. Your concern is noted but not warranted. Please complete your contracted work." I read this. I thought about it for a while. Then I printed a hard copy of my report, added a note that said filed and responded to on date, response received on date, disagreement noted, and put it in my personal work file, which I kept in my bunk in the contractor quarters. I am not a specialist. I could have been wrong about the codes. Drethval had access to documentation I didn't. I was a maintenance tech on a 6-week contract. I finished my lunch. I went back to work. The seismic event hit on a Thursday morning in week 4 at 04:17 local time. I was awake when it happened. I'm almost always awake at 04:17. I sleep in 3-hour blocks, which is something I've done since childhood. It's not insomnia. It's just the rhythm that stuck after growing up in a settlement where you kept a monitoring watch because the ground had opinions. At 04:17, I was sitting on my bunk with a cup of coffee, reviewing my work notes for the day, when I felt the first tremor. It was a 7, maybe a 7.2. Big for a facility event, though not unusual for Cauldron-9. The canyon wall systems are old and well loaded with stress fractures. I'd felt worse. What came next was not a tremor. There was a sound, low, structural, the kind of sound that a building makes when something in its skeleton has just changed. and then the lights went amber, and then the emergency channel on my suit comm opened up and started transmitting a tone that I recognized from the Velthari emergency protocol manual I'd read in my first week. Lower vault structural event, containment status unknown. I was already putting on my gear. The gear I travel with is better than what most contractors carry. This is not vanity. It's 11 years of doing work in environments where the standard issue contractor kit has killed people. My rad suit is a Class 19 hardshell, rated for Cauldron-9 surface conditions. My respirator is a full-seal double-filter unit. I carry a personal radiation monitor, a handheld atmospheric sensor, a structural analysis tool, and a med kit. I carry tools that are not on the standard contractor manifest because I've needed them before, and I've learned to anticipate the gap between what a facility says it has available and what is actually available when something goes wrong. I was suited and in the corridor outside my quarters in 4 minutes. The contractor quarters were on the middle level, which was where I needed to be. The facility's emergency lighting had activated red-amber strips along the corridor floor, adequate but not comfortable. I could hear, through the walls, the distant sound of the Velthari administrative staff moving, boots on deck plating, doors cycling, voices at a register that told me the organized calm of Velthari bureaucratic culture was not currently holding. My atmospheric sensor was reading the corridor air. Cauldron-9 background levels, nothing elevated yet. The lower vault was 2 levels down. Whatever had happened down there was contained, for the moment, by the blast doors. The blast doors whose seals I had flagged as degraded, in my first report, in week 1. I went to the mechanical room. The mechanical room was 40 meters down the corridor from my quarters, behind the ventilation plant. The ventilation system's status panel was on the wall beside the door. I looked at it and confirmed what I already suspected. The 2 bypass valves that I had flagged in week 3 were still stuck open. The negative pressure envelope was not functioning. If the lower vault blast door seals failed, the ventilation system would not contain the event. It would distribute it. The bypass valves were accessible from inside the mechanical room. I had not been authorized to operate them. I was aware of this. I went inside and operated them. The left valve was stuck, really stuck, not just stiff, and it took me 11 minutes and a pry bar from my kit to break it free. It moved. I got it closed. The right valve moved easier, 4 minutes. The ventilation status panel updated. Negative pressure envelope active, lower level. This did not fix the situation. What it did was change the geometry of the problem. If the blast door seals failed now, the contamination would move in a direction I had some ability to work with. I went back to the corridor. The emergency channel was still broadcasting the containment status tone. Nothing else. The Velthari emergency protocols, as I had read them, specified that in a lower vault containment event, all non-essential personnel were to proceed to the upper-level muster station and await further instruction. I was non-essential personnel. This was on my badge. I started walking toward the lower vault access corridor. My reasoning was simple. The seals on those blast doors were degraded. I'd seen them. I knew how degraded they were better than anyone currently in this facility, because I was the only person who had gone into that corridor and actually looked at them with functioning instruments in the past 14 months. The Velthari security cast would be assessing the situation from the administrative level, working from monitoring data and status panels, which was fine as far as it went. But the monitoring data was incomplete because 5 of the radiation containment monitors had been dark when I arrived, and only 2 of them had come back when I reconnected the power. The third was still dead. The gaps in the monitoring coverage were in the east wing lower section, which was, based on my reading of the colonial-era documents, where the older classified materials were stored. I was the only person in this facility who knew all of that. I went to the lower vault access corridor. The access corridor had a security gate at the top of the stairs. It was locked because of the emergency. The lock was a Velthari standard security model which I could not override. I stood at the gate for 30 seconds thinking. Then I went back to the mechanical room, found the access panel for the facility's secondary systems trunk, and traced the power circuit for the security gate to its breaker. I pulled the breaker. The gate lock released. This was not authorized. I was aware of this. I went through the gate. The stairway down to the lower vault access corridor was intact. No structural damage visible, no debris. The emergency lighting was functioning. My atmospheric sensor was still reading clean. Cauldron-9 background rad, nothing elevated. The blast doors were holding. I reached the lower vault access corridor and looked at the east wing blast door. The door was a colonial-era design, heavy durasteel, 3 meters by 4, with a hydraulic seal mechanism that ran around the perimeter. The seal I'd surveyed in week 1 had shown degradation along the lower left quadrant, hairline fractures in the gasket material, compression loss in the hydraulic line. Not critical at standard operating pressure, potentially critical under seismic stress loading. The door looked intact. The seal indicator on the wall panel was green, but the wall panel was one of the older units, and I'd already found in my survey that the lower vault wall panels had limited sensitivity. They read green until they didn't. I put my hand on the door. This is the thing I cannot fully explain to people who didn't grow up on Cauldron-9. It sounds like intuition or mysticism, and it's neither. It's pattern recognition built over years of living in a place where the difference between stable and not stable is something you learn to read through your feet, through your hands, through the low-frequency information that doesn't make it into the instruments. The door felt wrong. A very specific wrong, not imminent but stressed, and stressed in the quadrant I'd already flagged. I took out my structural analysis tool and ran it along the lower left seal perimeter. The tool's display said, seal compression loss 34%, hairline fracture propagation from 2.1 to 6.7 since last survey. Since my survey, 3 weeks ago. The seismic event had accelerated the degradation. The door was not going to hold through another event of the same magnitude. Given Cauldron-9's seismic cycle, another event of comparable or greater magnitude was not a remote possibility. It was a scheduling question. I filed this assessment on my comm to the emergency channel. I flagged it critical. I said, East Wing blast door seal is at failure threshold. Recommend immediate structural reinforcement or controlled evacuation of lower vault contents under containment protocol. The emergency channel acknowledged receipt. No response. The Velthari security coordinator was managing something, presumably the administrative level evacuation. I looked at the door. I looked at my kit. I am a structural and systems maintenance technician. I am not a miracles worker. I carry tools for the work I do, and the work I do involves diagnosing problems and implementing standard repairs within the parameters of my certification. What I was looking at was not a standard repair situation. It was a colonial-era blast door with a degrading seal in a seismically active zone, with an unknown radiological hazard on the other side. What I had in my kit that was relevant: emergency seal compound, which is a 2-part epoxy-based material rated for atmospheric containment use, not technically blast door rated but better than nothing. Hydraulic line repair patches, 4 of them which I'd brought because I'd flagged the hydraulic line as a concern in my survey. Structural adhesive, fast cure. And about 45 minutes of useful working time before my suit's thermal management would start working against me in the lower vault environment. I started working on the seal. The epoxy compound went in along the fracture lines first. This is slow work. You don't rush it or you get voids, and voids in a containment seal are worse than not patching at all. I worked the lower left quadrant from the floor up, pressing the compound into the fracture channels, smoothing it flush with the seal surface, monitoring the cure with my hand every 3 minutes. The hydraulic line patch went over the section of line I'd flagged in the original survey, a pressure patch, not a full repair, but enough to restore some of the compression the line had lost. I was 40 minutes into this when the second tremor hit. It was smaller than the first, a 5, maybe a 5.5, but it came while I was pressed against the blast door with my hand on the seal, and I felt it differently than I would have otherwise. I felt the door flex. Very slightly, a millimeter of movement along the lower left corner. The new compound held. The old gasket material moved. I kept working. The emergency channel opened. A Velthari voice, Security Coordinator Varath Das, whose voice I recognized from the staff briefing I'd attended in week 1, said, "All non-essential personnel report to upper-level muster station immediately. Lower vault structural integrity is compromised. This is a mandatory evacuation order." I acknowledged on my comm. I said, "I am at the east wing blast door performing emergency seal reinforcement. The seal is at failure threshold. I require 20 more minutes to complete the patch. Request hold on evacuation order for my position." Silence for a moment. Then, non-essential personnel are not authorized to perform seal reinforcement. Report to muster immediately. I said, "Understood. I'm going to finish the patch." I finished the patch. It took 26 minutes, not 20. The second hydraulic patch was harder to seat than I'd expected. The fitting had corroded slightly, and the patch wasn't mating clean, so I had to improvise a shim from a strip of foil tape in my kit, which is not in the technical manual, but works well enough for a temporary measure if you know what you're doing. When I was done, the seal wasn't good. It wasn't rated, but it was better than what it had been, and better was what I had available. I logged the repair in my work notes with materials used, method, time, and my assessment of the repair's limits. Temporary reinforcement. Estimated integrity improvement sufficient for 1 additional seismic event at comparable magnitude. Recommend priority permanent repair by qualified structural team. Then I went to find out what was happening in the rest of the facility. The emergency channel was active with Velthari coordination traffic. I listened while I moved. The picture was this. The seismic event had caused a partial collapse in the lower vault west wing. Structural, not seal failure. A section of ceiling had come down and damaged 2 of the storage chamber doors. The damage hadn't breached containment. The inner vessel integrity was still holding, but the structural collapse had also taken out the lower vault's primary power bus, which meant the monitoring systems down there were running on battery backup, which meant the Velthari were working partially blind. The contamination monitors I'd reconnected in week 3, the 2 that had come back were on the middle level, not the lower vault. They were reading elevated, not critically elevated, but higher than Cauldron-9 background. This meant something in the lower vault was leaking, at a low level. This was consistent with the seal degradation I'd documented. Small seeps, not a breach, for now. I went back up to the middle level and found the ventilation status panel. The negative pressure system I'd activated was holding. The elevated readings were not propagating through the ventilation system. The geometry was working. The containment was soft, but it was there. I updated my incident log with all of this and filed it on the emergency channel. Security Coordinator Varath Das opened a direct channel to my comm. He said, "Maintenance Contractor Osai, you are currently in a restricted area without authorization during an active emergency. You are ordered to proceed to the muster station on the upper level." I said, "I understand. I want to give you a status update first." He said, "You are not a safety officer." I said, "The negative pressure envelope is active." I closed the bypass valves in the mechanical room at 0431. The east wing blast door has been patch reinforced, temporary, not rated, but it's better than it was. The contamination monitors on the middle level are reading elevated. I can send you the numbers. The West Wing structural situation I don't have visibility on. If the West Wing vault doors are taking seismic load with degraded seals, they're going to go before the East Wing door does. Silence. Then, how do you know about the West Wing vault doors? I said, I surveyed the entire lower vault access corridor in week 1. I flagged the seal condition in my first report. More silence. Then proceed to the muster station. I said, if the West Wing doors go, the negative pressure envelope buys you about 40 minutes of containment before the middle level monitors go critical. I'm in the mechanical room. I can monitor the envelope and maintain it if something changes. Going to the muster station means you lose that. He didn't respond for 90 seconds. 90 seconds is a long time on an emergency channel. I counted. Then he said, stay in the mechanical room. Do not go below the middle level. Report status every 15 minutes. I said understood. I stayed in the mechanical room. The third tremor hit at 06:44. It was an 8. I was standing at the ventilation status panel when the floor moved, and the floor moved in a way that I recognized, not the rolling pulse of a distant event, but the sharp vertical kick of something close, something in the canyon wall structure directly beneath the facility. The emergency lighting flickered. Something in the ventilation plant made a sound like a cable snapping. The status panel went dark for 4 seconds and came back. The negative pressure reading was still active. Barely. One of the pumps had dropped output. I went into the ventilation plant, found the pump array, identified the one that had dropped, a colonial-era unit, older than anything else in the system, with a maintenance tag dated 8 years ago, and did what I could with it. The impeller housing had shifted on its mounts, which was reducing intake efficiency. I couldn't remount it without the right tooling, and I didn't have the right tooling, so I wedged it with what I had, a section of duct brace from a spare parts bin, tightened down with a fastener I pulled from a non-critical panel nearby. Not elegant. It brought the pump output back to about 70%. 70% was enough to maintain the envelope, probably, for now. The emergency channel was very busy. What I pieced together from the traffic, the third tremor had collapsed the West Wing blast door in the lower vault. Not the inner vessels, the door itself had buckled under the structural load, and the seal had failed. The radiological monitoring data, what existed of it, was showing a contamination release into the West Wing corridor of the lower vault. The Velthari personnel who had been attempting to assess the West Wing structural damage from the corridor had evacuated immediately. The automated containment systems in the lower vault had activated flood seal dampers, designed to isolate the wing, but 2 of the dampers were not responding, which according to the traffic was because the power bus damage from the first event had taken them offline. The lower vault was not contained. The negative pressure envelope I was maintaining was the last line. Everything below the middle level that was in the West Wing was in the event zone. The East Wing blast door, the one I'd patched, was holding. For now. Drethval's voice appeared on the emergency channel. The flat bureaucratic tone was gone. He said, all Velthari personnel begin evacuation to the surface staging area. Security coordinator, confirm headcount. Then after a pause, contractor Osei, report. I said, negative pressure envelope is active and holding at approximately 70% capacity. East Wing blast door patch is intact after the third event. The West Wing situation, if the contamination is in the corridor and the flood seal dampers aren't holding, the only thing keeping it on the lower level is the stairway geometry and the negative pressure draw. The moment the envelope drops, the contamination will propagate up. How long until you can get a certified containment team here? He said 6 hours minimum. The surface access road sustained damage. The emergency response team is airborne from the regional station. I said, what's in the West Wing vaults, specifically? Long pause. He said, colonial-era processing byproducts, early generation, containment vessels rated for a pause while he apparently checked something, rated for 40 years under standard conditions. I said, these vessels are 43 years old, in a seismically active zone, in a facility where the monitoring systems weren't fully functional. He said nothing. I said, what specific compounds? I need to know what I'm working with if the envelope fails. Another pause. Then quietly enough that I wasn't sure I was supposed to hear it, radiolytic residuals class 4, vorthanite processing waste. I knew what vorthanite processing waste was. It's a colonial-era ore byproduct with a specific radiological signature, high-energy alpha emission, contained reasonably well by standard shielding but problematic in an aerosolized state. If the containment vessels were compromised and the material was aerosolized by the structural event, the lower vault west wing was genuinely dangerous to anything without a hardshell rad suit. My suit was a Class 19 hardshell, rated for Cauldron-9 surface conditions, which includes the background vorthanite signature from the 3 collapsed processing stations on the northern shelf. I had grown up in that background. My body had spent 38 years processing it. My suit had been tested against it. I did the math. I said, I need a layout of the West Wing lower vault, access points, vessel positions, and the location of the non-responding flood seal dampers. Drethval said, you are a maintenance contractor, classification 9, non-essential personnel. I said, yes. Do you want the dampers closed or not? Silence. He transmitted the layout. I will not describe what the West Wing lower vault looked like in fine detail, because I wrote all of that in the incident log, and the log is what matters. What I will say is this. The third tremor had done significant structural work in that wing, sealing material down in 2 sections. One of the storage chamber doors fully buckled, the inner vessel intact but the outer door destroyed. The contamination in the corridor was real. My personal radiation monitor was reading elevated, higher than the middle-level monitors had shown, in the range I'd expect for a low-level aerosolization from a partially compromised vessel. Not a full breach. Not yet. The 2 non-responding flood seal dampers were at the junction between the west wing and the central lower vault corridor. The junction was the critical point. If the contamination reached the central corridor, it had a path to the stairway, and then the negative pressure envelope would be working against us instead of for us. The dampers were manual override capable. The power bus damage had taken out the automatic actuators, but the manual override handles were mechanical, independent of the power system. I'd seen this in the colonial-era documentation. The Velthari staff hadn't known to look for it. I went to the junction. I found the dampers. The manual override handles were on the north face of the junction housing, corroded, stiff from 43 years of non-use, but intact. The left damper took 7 minutes to close. I had to use my full body weight on the handle and work it in short increments, moving it a few degrees at a time, stopping when the resistance peaked and starting again. The right damper was easier, maybe 5 minutes. When both were closed, the junction was sealed. The contamination was now isolated to the west wing. The central corridor was clean. The negative pressure envelope could hold that geometry for the 6 hours until the response team arrived. I did a walk of the central lower vault corridor to confirm no propagation. Then I came back up to the middle level, went to the mechanical room, checked the ventilation system, noted that my jury-rigged pump mount was holding, updated my atmospheric readings, and logged everything. Time was 09:22. I had been in the facility's event zone, at various points, for 5 hours and 5 minutes. I made coffee from the supplies in my kit. I carry a thermal flask and a 1-cup brewing unit, because I've learned that long events have long waits in them, and hot coffee is not a luxury. It's a productivity maintenance tool, and I drank it while I updated my incident log. The log was now 17 pages in my work tablet. It had entries covering the bypass valve closure at 0431, the east wing blast door patch at 0506 through 0532, the ventilation pump intervention at 0649, the west wing lower vault entry and manual damper closure at 0714 through 0855, all atmospheric readings, all structural observations, all communications with Velthari staff. Every time materials used methods assessment. I wrote the log the same way I write all my logs, plainly, specifically, without editorializing. What I found, what I did, what I used, what I assessed. This is not heroism documentation, it's just how you write a log. If something goes wrong after your shift, the next person needs to know exactly what you left them. At 10:15, Drethval opened a direct channel. He said, "Contractor Osai, status." I said, "Middle level is clean. East wing blast door patch is intact. West wing dampers are manually closed, both sealed, junction is contained. Ventilation negative pressure is holding at approximately 70%. The contamination is isolated to the west wing lower vault. The structural situation down there is significant but containable for your response team." He said, "You went into the lower vault west wing." I said, "I closed the dampers." He said, "The west wing corridor was in the event zone." I said, "Yes." He said, "Your suit, is it?" I said, "Class 19 hardshell, Cauldron-9 surface rated, I'm fine." Silence. Then, "The response team will arrive in approximately 3.5 hours." I said, "I'll maintain the envelope until they arrive." He said nothing for a moment. Then, "Why?" I said, "Because if the envelope drops, the contamination propagates up and 6 hours of work becomes a larger problem for more people." He said, "That is not your contracted responsibility." I said, "I know." He was quiet again for a long time. Then he said very quietly, "Thank you, Contractor Osai." I said, "I'll file a full report when the response team arrives. They'll want the incident log." The response team arrived at 13:47. 4 certified Velthari containment specialists and a structural engineer. I met them at the outer blast door, the facility's main entrance, the one I'd come in through 6 weeks ago, and gave them the situation verbally before handing over my work tablet. The lead specialist was a woman named Assessor Threvikal. She was shorter than most Velthari I'd met, with a focused, efficient quality that I recognized as the specific intelligence of someone who has dealt with a lot of bad situations and has learned to prioritize ruthlessly. She went through my incident log in about 4 minutes, reading quickly, pausing twice to ask a clarifying question. Then she said, "You closed the west wing dampers manually?" I said, "Yes." She said, "The manual override documentation on this facility's lower vault, that's colonial era information. It wouldn't have been in the standard emergency protocols." I said, "No, I found it in the archive when I was researching the vault contents." She said, "You researched the vault contents?" I said, "I filed a report in week 1 recommending a review. I filed a second report in week 3. Both were returned without action." She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "I would like a copy of those reports." I said, "They're in the incident log, pages 3 and 7. She nodded once and went into the facility with her team. The formal debrief happened 2 days later, in a temporary administrative structure the Velthari had assembled on the surface staging area while the facility was being assessed. Drethval was present. So was Assessor Threvikal, a senior official I'd not met before named Regional Director Solith Varn, and a Velthari legal administrator whose function I gathered was to document whatever was said. I brought my work tablet. I brought the original printed copies of my 3 safety reports, with the response timestamps. Drethval looked at the printed reports and said nothing. Regional Director Solith Varn, older than Drethval, ridge skull prominent, moving with the particular economy of a person accustomed to having a great deal of authority, looked at the printed reports for a longer time. Then he looked at me. He said, Contractor Osai, I've reviewed the emergency channel logs and Assessor Threvikal's preliminary report. I have some questions. I said, yes, sir. He said, you bypassed a security gate. I said, yes. He said, you operated systems, specifically the ventilation bypass valves, without authorization. I said, yes. He said, you entered the lower vault access corridor without authorization. You performed seal reinforcement work without authorization. You entered the lower vault west wing without authorization. I said, yes. He said, each of these actions was a violation of your contract terms and of Velthari facility safety protocols. I said, yes. He looked at me for another moment. Then he said, the West Wing contamination assessment is complete. If the junction flood seal dampers had not been manually closed before the contamination reached the central corridor, the response team's assessment suggests that the propagation through the ventilation system would have reached the upper level within approximately 2 hours of the third seismic event. The facility's administrative and operations staff were still in the upper level at that point. The evacuation to the surface staging area was not complete until 07:55. He stopped. I waited. He said, your safety reports, the 3 reports filed in weeks 1 through 4, have been reviewed. The assessment of the seal conditions and the ventilation bypass status was accurate. The assessment of the lower vault classified materials was also accurate. The materials are Vorthanite processing byproducts, Class 4. The classification codes you cross-referenced were the correct interpretation. I looked at Drethval. He was looking at the table. Solith Varn said, the responses to your safety reports, the non-action responses, are being reviewed as part of a facility management audit. That process is not your concern. What is your concern is your contract status. I said, I understand I've violated the contract terms. He said, yes, you have. He paused. The violations are being classified as emergency necessity interventions under Colonial Administration Code 742, which provides for contract term violations performed in good faith to prevent a greater safety event. The classification requires a formal assessment of whether the interventions were necessary, proportionate, and performed without grossly reckless disregard for safety. Assessor Threvikal's preliminary report finds all 3 criteria met. He looked at me steadily. He said, your contract will not be terminated. Your contracted hours will be paid in full. Additionally, and this is outside standard contract terms, the regional office is prepared to offer a supplemental compensation for the emergency interventions, contingent on your review and signature of a formal incident report. I said, I've already written an incident log. It's 17 pages. He said, I've read it. A pause. It's thorough. I signed the formal incident report. I reviewed it against my own log and found it accurate. I signed it, collected my pay documentation, and asked Clerk Tertiary Orvine, who was present at the table, very quiet, looking at nothing in particular, where I signed for my hours. He found the form. I signed. I went back to the contractor quarters, packed my kit, and arranged transport off facility. Before I left, Assessor Threvikal stopped me in the staging area. She was carrying a datapad. She said, I want to ask you something off the record. I said, all right. She said, the West Wing lower vault. The contamination levels in there when you went in to close the dampers, our monitors are showing what the environment would have read at that point. It was in the range where any Velthari staff member would have been at immediate risk without a containment suit. You had a Class 19 hardshell, which is rated for surface conditions, but inside a partial aerosolization event with Vorthanite byproducts. She stopped. How was your exposure? I said, within my tolerance range. She said, your personal tolerance range. I said, yes. She said, because of Cauldron-9. I said, yes. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in 40 years of containment work, I've never seen a manual damper closure under those conditions. The protocol would be to seal the stairway and wait for the response team. I said, the protocol would have cost you 2 hours before the contamination reached the upper level. She said, yes. I said, Cauldron-9 doesn't really teach you to wait. She looked at me for a long moment, not the way Drethval had looked at me when I arrived, not scanning my form for where to file me. Something else. The look of someone who has just revised an estimate significantly. She said, no, I imagine it doesn't. She held out her hand, flat palm up, which is the Velthari formal acknowledgement gesture, the kind used between colleagues, not between administrator and contractor. I pressed my palm to hers. Then I went to catch my transport. The transport was a 6-hour flight to the northern Shelfport, and then a 40-minute surface transit to Korvath settlement. I spent the flight writing up my final contract notes and cleaning my kit. My rad suit went into its case. My tools went into their rolls. I threw away the foil tape I'd used as a shim in the ventilation pump housing because it was spent. I refilled the emergency seal compound canisters from my resupply stock. I always travel with resupply stock, and noted in my inventory that I was short 2 hydraulic line patches and would need to reorder. The flight was smooth. Cauldron-9 doesn't do smooth air exactly, but the canyon systems on the eastern continent get calmer at altitude than they look from the ground. I watched the eastern plateau pass below and drank the last of my coffee from the flask. My work tablet was open to the incident log, 17 pages. I read it once from the beginning, not to check it, I'd already checked it, but because it was mine and I wanted to see it complete. What I'd found, what I'd done, what I'd left for the next person. The seal on the east wing blast door, the patch I'd made from emergency compound and hydraulic line patches, and a strip of foil tape, was going to hold until the response team replaced it properly. I was reasonably confident of that. It wasn't rated for what it was supposed to hold, and I'd said so in the log, and Assessor Threvikal's team would replace it with something rated. That was the right sequence. The dampers were closed, the envelope had held, the people on the upper level had gotten out. That was the job. I closed the tablet, put it in my kit, and looked out the window at the northern shelf coming into view, the Korvath Canyon, the settlement lights at the base of the ridge, the particular copper-gray color of the Cauldron-9 sky that I've never seen anywhere else and that I can't fully describe to people who haven't grown up under it. It's not a beautiful sky by most standards. It's not meant to be. I was home. The formal audit of Vault Station Marath 7 safety management practices concluded 8 months later. I wasn't a party to it, contractors aren't, typically. But Assessor Threvikal sent me a message when it was complete. She said the audit had found systematic non-action on safety reports across a 3-year period, had recommended a facility management restructure, and an immediate review of all Colonial-era vault contents across the regional extraction network, and had classified the safety interventions during the seismic event as critical, necessary, and directly responsible for preventing a major contamination event. She also said, and this was the line that stayed with me, the audit reviewed your 3 pre-event safety reports and the response documentation. The formal finding is that the reports were accurate, timely, and appropriately escalated. The record reflects this. I read the message twice. I filed it in my work archive. Then I refilled my coffee, opened the tablet to my current contract notes. I was 4 weeks into a system survey on a Velthari processing platform in the outer extraction zone. Different facility, different administrator, same laminated badge, and went back to work. The badge still says non-essential personnel. I've stopped finding that funny. Not because it bothers me, it doesn't, but because funny implies there's something surprising in it, and there isn't any more. I know what the classification means to them when they write it. I know what it means on the days when the ground moves and the seals fail and someone has to close the dampers. Those two things have very little to do with each other. I finished my coffee. I got back to work.